My name is Andrea Gray. I am the Director of Operations for the Stanford Sustainability Accelerator. As Keegan mentioned, I think all the talks this morning mentions policy in some way, shape, or form. And this next panel is going to do a deeper dive into that topic, talking about the role of policy and government relations in sustainability innovation. So I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Michael Wara, who will be the moderator of this conversation. Michael is a lawyer and a scholar focused on climate and energy policy. He is the director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program and a senior research scholar at the Stanford Woods Institute, as well as the senior director of policy at the Sustainability Accelerator. His legal and policy scholarship focuses on wildfire, climate mitigation, energy innovation, and regulated industries. Michael has served as a wildfire commissioner for the state of California, as a consultant to the Senate on wildfire issues, and as a consultant on the utility wildfire risk management. He received his JD here at Stanford Law School, and he has a PhD in ocean science from UC Santa Cruz.
Go Slugs.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to Michael to introduce the other two panelists.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm thrilled to have our two panelists today for a conversation. I think they represent different perspectives that are really both very important to any conversation about the role of policy and government in scaling sustainability solutions. First, we have Kate Gordon, who most recently, she is currently at UC Berkeley, Haas School of Business. Before that, until recently, was Secretary Granholm's senior advisor, and I think played a particularly important role in developing the approach that DOE has on community benefits agreements, in implementing the infrastructure bill and the broad set of industrial policy that DOE has been rolling out under the Biden administration. Prior to that, she played an important role in state government in California as the director of the Office of Planning and Research, and has been doing this sort of integrated economic policy, sustainability, and climate and energy-focused work for more than 2 decades. Sitting next to Kate is Ben Serrurier. Ben is the head of government relations for what I think of as one of the most interesting and important companies trying to scale in the energy transition, Fervo Energy. Ben's going to tell you more about Fervo, but I'll just say, Ben has also played a series of important and interesting roles prior to Fervo at Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, and prior to that at Cypress Creek Renewables, doing the work of scaling technologies that are going to contribute to a zero carbon electricity system and hopefully broader energy system. I'm really thrilled to have both of you on the panel today, and I just want to give you a few minutes to sort of kick it off and talk about your perspective on why policy matters and how it matters in scaling sustainability solutions. Kate, would you like to?
Wow, it's a huge question. Well, thank you, first of all. It's great to be here. I'm sorry for the people on this side of me. My mic is on this side, and so I was told I had to face it this way, so I'll do my best to look back and forth. In the world of climate, whether you're dealing with the impacts or you're dealing with the energy transition, there's nothing that isn't policy, honestly. I mean, every one of the things that we're talking about, every one of these solutions has a market because of policy, has a market because either there's a commitment to reducing emissions and there's a market around that, because there's carrots and sticks around that, or because the fiscal impacts of climate on actual supply chains and projects, or because we're all kind of trying to figure out how to move toward this world a few decades in the future where literally everything looks different than it does today. All of that is policy, right? So you can't, part of the reason that carbon removal is suddenly so hot is because there's a voluntary market that got created by Stripe. That was brought on partly by policy decisions because of the value of removed carbon through the 45Q program in the low carbon fuel standard. So all of it's policy related. I think it's in the environmental world where some people kind of sometimes think like, oh, this is just environmental regulation and we're just grafting it on to carbon. And I think when people think in that framework, you think, oh, I only need government relations or policy because I have to think about like how I'm being regulated. But in fact, this world is really different than that. It is a world of actual politics and policy moves and what Congress is thinking about certain types of technologies that in some cases is because it's what works in their specific region for specific geographies or geologies. That really, really matters. So it's much more important, I think, even than it has been in the past.
Okay, I mean, it's funny you say it's all policy. When, from a commercial perspective, so Fervo is a developer of next generation geothermal energy projects. We use enhanced geothermal, which is accessing the heat in hot, impermeable rock, opens up clean, firm power generation, certainly across the West this decade and probably next decade across the country and the world. Obviously, we'll probably say more about that because that's all I can talk about now. But from a policy perspective, everything we do as a project developer is policy. And it's always sort of frustrated me as a policy person to work at companies and hear people talk in the clean tech space about you don't want to invest in anything that's policy dependent.
Right.
Like, is baffling to me, that idea, because everything we do, from origination of projects and contracts, the market environment, delivery of that electricity that we generate, the deliverability environment, transmission, the operational environment, permitting and resource use, the financial environment, tax credits, capital subsidies, all of these things are policy dependent. And so the way we think about it at Fervo is if I am good at my job, any wood around here?
There's no wood.
If we're successful on the policy and government affairs team, I'm making the job of all of my colleagues easier, and therefore we're able to move faster towards the goal of deploying more, in our case, clean, firm power. So we can go into depth on a lot of this. I think one of the things that I'm interested in exploring here is thinking about how different technologies fit into different policy areas and what the role of policy is trying to do to reach that goal. Like, there's broad, sort of diffuse policies, say carbon pricing has a lot of wide-ranging impacts, and then there's more targeted policies of different stripes that try to accomplish a particular goal in the market, but all of them are affecting the environment that we're operating in from a commercial standpoint. It makes a huge, huge difference in our ability in space to move.
How do you both think about so I want to just launch off from something you just said, Ben, and something we've talked about in the past as well, which is that different kinds of policy support are going to be more or less useful, applicable to technologies as they evolve and scale. And that, it may be great to have a carbon tax or a PTC, production tax credit, if you are a mature technology that is de-risked and has ready access to project finance. But that may not be so helpful if you're earlier in the process. And we heard in the last panel about the very successful, huge array of startups that are in this space, in this neck of the woods. But in order for them to get to whatever measure of scale you want, whether it's gigawatt or gigaton, they're going to have to cross a bunch of transitions. And where do you see, from where you sit, where we've done a lot in the United States to try to fill in some or build bridges across some of those transitions? Maybe there are still gaps. What do you think are the biggest successes we've had over the last 5 years or so, or maybe 3 years, and the biggest challenges that remain for new technologies to get to scale, new approaches to sustainability to get to scale?
That's a huge question. You want to start?
Well, I was sure.
I'm not going to ask small questions. Come on.
I appreciate that much. So I think the way to think about this, think about DOE.
Yeah.
And DOE, I think, has gone through many iterations. Kate knows this much better than I, but from the narrow Fervo Energy perspective, we're working along the DOE pathway. So one way to think about the DOE commercialization pathway that I think is effective is starting at very early stage R&D. And so you've got the national labs. Yep. Fervo was founded on the Stanford campus by 2 Stanford grad students, and then worked at the LBNL sort of startup accelerator. And so we are really born out of that R&D, early R&D commercialization pathway. Those are small grants, basic research, hugely important. The next phase up is starting to get into sort of ARPA-E seed type funding. You're starting to build prototypes and flesh out the idea. Then, if you continue to be successful, the idea moves into the EERE, the energy efficiency and renewable energy.
Yeah.
EERE portion of DOE, which is trying to do sort of pilot grants and sort of smaller scale, but hopefully working the way it should commercially. Then, if you're successful, you move to OCED, the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which is new and really fantastic and exciting.
Or LPO.
Well, yeah, this is an interesting point of
Yeah.
tension, though, because at OCED, they're doing first-of-kind, big grants for the most part, conditional, but not alone. It's a grant, large amounts, and that's where we see the hydrogen hubs and stuff like that. Then LPO, you're doing your first big project. Then LPO probably takes you from your second to your fifth project or something like that, and that's more of a commercial bank, a lot more diligence, longer process. Now, that sounds great, right? That's the whole pathway from soup to nuts, innovation, and then the private market steps in and yay, infrastructure funding. We see this working very well up to now. Fervo, because we were not involved and because the geothermal industry is very small and has a generally small voice in DC, did not show up at the table during the discussion of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And not out of any maliciousness, but there was basically no funding for deployment of next generation geothermal in the BIL. That's not totally true. There was $84 million that is pretty small compared to the other demonstration fundings that were out there, and there's no funding at OCED. This is all within EERE. That's kind of in the weeds policy stuff, but the point that matters is that we're at the stage that Fervo is now. We're building a 400 megawatt project in southwest Utah. That's perfect for OCED. That's perfect for the scale and the opportunity to put that money to work.
They don't have the money for it.
And there's nowhere that fits. So we're in a phase 2 application with LPO. I think that's going to continue to work well. We enjoy working with DOE as best we can. But it's an uneasy fit there. And so if there's any gap in that funding process, the whole process doesn't really have a fallback option to it, and it becomes very hard to cross that valley of death.
Yeah, I think, thanks for talking about DOE. I mean, DOE is a really important, you heard it in the last panel too, it's really, really important in this space, and even more so now than it was before. Up until 2 years ago, DOE was primarily a research and science organization, primarily the 17 national labs, ARPA-E, yes, LPO, but LPO hadn't made a loan, as folks know, since the Obama administration. So primarily in that basic science space, and primarily focused on, getting folks off the ground, getting the best widget at the best, right, the best technology off the ground. The Biden administration as a whole has really embraced the idea that the US should be doing industrial policy, and I'll just say, I think that's really important because part of your earlier question too, Michael, is we're working with an existing infrastructure that was entirely designed on fossil fuels and for a particular type of technologies. And now we're trying to shift the whole thing. So the infrastructure has to change, the financing has to change, the corporate structures have to change, everything has to change. And so you can't just be about the best widget coming onto that infrastructure. The infrastructure bill was a big stake in the ground to say, actually, we have to change all the infrastructure. We have to think about EV charging as infrastructure. We have to think about grid reliability as infrastructure. All of that is massive. DOE got $62 billion in that bill. DOE's normal annual appropriations is $45 billion outside of the nuclear context. So more than the annual appropriation for this one bill. 60 programs were new coming out of that bill for DOE. So we had to not only start getting the money out the door, but we had to redesign the entire agency. We created an Office of Infrastructure that had never existed before. OCED, the Office of Clean Energy Deployment, had never existed before. It was created by the infrastructure bill. David Crane, who now runs the Office of Infrastructure, that was a new undersecretary position. So that's a big deal. Redesigning, you guys have been through reorgs. Reorging a 19,000 person organization is a big deal. Big deal. Doing it fast so the money starts getting out the door is a big deal. So we're doing that while we're hiring 1,000 people, while we're designing all of the funding opportunity announcements. Huge shift in Department of Energy, but I think really important because it's kind of a stake in the ground that all of this underlying infrastructure is part of what it will take to then do better at the new companies and the new innovation coming in, happening all the time through all those other parts of the department. It's tricky though, and to your point, I mean, Ben's absolutely right. There isn't like a place that catches the stuff that falls through the cracks. because all the appropriations from Congress are for specific programs on specific technologies in specific offices. You can't actually, even if I'm working in some community where I'm like, I did a lot of this work, so I'll just use this example. They have a retired coal plant, what are we gonna do with the coal plant? Like from my perspective, that's like we should have like a choose your own adventure system where we're like, let's find out everything we can about the coal plant. Let's find out what the asset is, what does it look like, is there interconnection, how many active units are there, what else is happening in that area, what can we do with it? But if you're at the Department of Energy, that first, what's the coal plant look like we did that with Pacific Northwest National Lab. We did a big report on this, which is available. You can find out everything you want to know about every coal plant in the United States and what it could be used for. But then going from that to like the adventure of what it becomes is 17 different offices, because it might go solar and storage and that's over here, or it might be small modular reactor and that's over here, or you might do something with geothermal if it's nearby and that's a totally different place. There's nobody whose job it is, Congress has not appropriated any money to this critical work in this space, which is knitting all that stuff together, which is, I just think, a huge hole, actually, in the policy world for this stuff, but also in, honestly, like everywhere. It's just a hole in the system. The last thing I'm going to say, because Ben made the point about how geothermal wasn't at the table, great example of why this is also about politics. The people who were organized and at the table for the infrastructure bill, CHIPS and Science and IRA, got a lot out of those bills. A lot. And that's very specific. They got their specific technology to be paid attention to. You're talking about congressional offices that are not experts. They know what they hear from people, and you have to be in the room.
And early, too.
And early.
I mean, Fervo existed, but our commercial scale pilot project started operating end of last year. So, like, what are we going to go into congressional offices and be like, no, trust us, give us a lot of money because we will be there? And it's like, nah, it's not going to play.
Well, and super practical point on that, one of the things we saw work really well with the battery manufacturers, who were little. I mean, Form and, they're not silo technologies, they're small. They just formed an alliance really early because they were like, we might be competitors out there, but we all share the need for public dollars, for a workforce to be developed. Like, we have these common needs for this emerging industry. And they formed an alliance early, and that was very smart thing for them to do.
I'll just say we see these challenges today in our first major, what we call our flagship destination, but sort of generally speaking, a thematic investment in the accelerator in the carbon dioxide removal space, where the tax credits are written really with a particular technology in mind, but it may be the promising technology that scales. It faces some hurdles, direct air capture, but there are a whole suite of technologies involving ocean alkalinity and enhanced rock weathering that are really not eligible in the same way, even though they may ultimately be the most promising technologies, and they were not at the table because this is rapidly advancing science and engineering. And we're going to, how we revisit those issues is going to be complex given the very complicated politics.
And it's hard to go back. It's
Yeah.
really hard to go back just because you guys all watch Schoolhouse Rock or its equivalent, if you're younger. Like, you can't actually change the law.
This is my job right now. It's very hard.
Department of Energy is not actually allowed to change the underlying statute. They implement the statute. So you can do a lot with implementation, like create the community benefits plan structure, but you can't do everything with implementation.
Yeah, and they got 60, as you said, a huge budget increase. I go in and like, hey, but we're doing cool stuff. And they're like, we can't give any more money to OSED. Are you kidding me? They have so much money. And I'm like, yeah, it's for hydrogen. But
nothing wrong with hydrogen.
we're working. No, I'm just saying.
So I want to pick up on a different theme and just come to it, which is the energy infrastructure we have in the United States was largely constructed at a time where structural racism allowed infrastructure to be built in ways that are totally unacceptable today. And we face a challenge in the United States and on a planetary scale where we need to build a lot of infrastructure in the next several decades, but we need to do it in a way that's fundamentally different in terms of the social compact than, at least in democratic societies, than we did when we built version 1, which runs on coal and natural gas and oil. And that's, and so I guess what I want to ask is, and I know, Kate, you've been heavily involved in thinking about this, but I think startups and companies that are serious about scale also have to be thinking about this.
100%.
How do you think about community engagement and community consent when it comes to building a lot of, like if Fervo is going to be the clean, firm power provider in the Western United States, it's got to build gigawatts in the next decade. And that's going to require the consent of many, many communities.
Yep.
All of the infrastructure that DOE is trying to facilitate the construction of through the hubs programs and everything else under the IRA involves communities. Either both of you, I'd love to hear your perspective on how you approach scale and community consent.
I mean, this is, as you know, my life, both in the California government, in providing funding for regions to think this stuff through and set those tables to the federal. So what we did at DOE, and let me just talk for a second about why it was so important. I mean, again, I'm going to keep saying industrial policy because this all is basically industrial policy. Shifting from an economy that is built on this existing infrastructure, but also essentially has three inputs, right? Like coal, oil, and gas, that are all extracted and mined and refined and moved around and traded globally, to one that is like massive numbers of distributed different types of technologies, many of which have to be connected by wires or moved around on roads or by rail. That is a very different economy. It requires, as you said, an enormous amount of domestic investment into industry. It is an industrial economy. We are not moving to an economy that, I always say this in the class I teach here, if you Google clean energy economy, you get these beautiful pictures of like rolling hills with like one turbine and a little house. And it's like, so I don't know where the steel came from for that turbine, but somewhere, right? And like, I don't know who works there. And I mean, it is still an industrial economy. There's, critical minerals, right? Huge amounts of different types of projects. There's mining we have to talk about. I mean, this is a very serious conversation. And so I think, the Biden administration and Secretary Granholm were very, very focused on doing as much of that domestically as possible, both because we just went through COVID and saw what happens if our supply chains are not resilient, but also because those are middle-skilled jobs. Those are the jobs for the vast majority of the workforce that doesn't have a four-year college degree. Those are wealth-creating jobs. So first I want to say there is an equity interest in doing industry well. It is more equitable to do industry well. You are building wealth in communities. You are creating economic mobility. You are providing a ladder for people. It is super important. Sometimes I think we have these things on two hands as if we're weighing them against each other. Like, oh, there's equity over here, and then there's like this industrial jobs thing over here. They actually can be part of the same thing. So what we did at DOE was create this community benefits plan structure where all this money coming in for the infrastructure bill and then going out again to the private sector, Congress designed that so it would just go out again. Like DOE is a pass-through, basically. And the secretary said, how do we ensure that there's real benefits to the communities and the workers and the tribal lands where these things are happening? So we created a system within the procurement system that said that 20% of the application had to be based on a community benefits plan, which actually includes both what kind of jobs are you creating, what kind of economic mobility are you creating, who's getting the jobs, how are you diversifying that set of people and your contractors, and also what are you doing, back to your question, for communities that have been historically left out of the positive benefits of economic development. We can talk a lot about that. It's super interesting. Many of you have probably engaged with that system. It's constantly evolving. But I think to your point, Michael, like there's a couple things to say about that. One, this is still an industrial economy. Two, we can do industry way better than we did in the past. Way better. We've learned a lot. There's a lot of technologies. There's a lot of folks here who are building technologies to do industrial decarb. It's really, really advanced from where it was. Three, we should be taking advantage of existing industrial land and facilities to repurpose them to do this. We should not be taking a bunch of greenfield land and building out a whole new industrial infrastructure. When we already have an industrial infrastructure, we have a lot of great assets. But that means that a lot of this development is going to be in those same communities that have been industrial in the past. So my point would be, let's do it better. Let's make sure that we're actually creating jobs and wealth opportunities for those communities. And let's think about economic mobility, because the question shouldn't be, I have a disadvantaged community, how do I get cheap things that are clean into that community? The question should be, I have a disadvantaged community that doesn't want to be disadvantaged anymore. How do I actually build an economy that works for people? So, long answer, but as you know, this is like my bread and butter.
The community benefits plan was something that my colleagues and I worked on at Rocky Mountain Institute, and we're all about, and worked a lot on the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program at LPO. So it's cool to see this on the project development side. Fervo entered Beaver County, which is a county of about 10,000 people, population density of about 2.5 people per square mile in southwest Utah, right at a time when the Smithfield hog operations in that county, which constituted the large bulk of their employment base, they employed the mayor
And
to
tax
basically
base,
everyone.
probably.
Yeah, it was yes, huge.
Huge tax
Had just announced that they were going to shutter all of their operations in a consolidation move, and it was just rocked the economy of the county. We have been working very closely with the county to leverage our investment and our development for the broader uses of that county. And that means, inland port funding, road upgrades, everything we can do to attract grant money and to bring in other businesses for what their goals are. It's funny because so many times when you talk to people about jobs, they say, oh, we need to talk jobs figures, and everyone wants the biggest job figure of job creation. And we came into Beaver and we had some NREL model that pumped out a number of jobs, job years or whatever the metric we used, and it was huge. And I think we had it on a flyer and we're really proud of it. And the county said, are you kidding me? We're 10,000 people total. You're going to employ 6,000 people at this thing? And we're like, well, we'll back that up a little bit. So thinking about what the county desires are, which is housing, it's sustainable growth. It's not necessarily like a rocket ship growth that, say, our investors necessarily want to see. So working with them to the best of our ability to make them not only comfortable with the project that we're building and the various concerns that they have around construction, but also working to invest in apprenticeship programs, which the Inflation Reduction Act requires in terms of our tax credits, and going to the oil and gas industry, which are largely our suppliers, Schlumberger, et cetera, and talking to them about apprenticeships and tracking their wages and doing things they haven't done before, because the Inflation Reduction Act is pushing new policies on us that we're pushing on them. And that's been a challenging conversation, but I think a very productive one. The last thing I want to say about the broader system and structural inequalities here is we're building clean, firm power in Utah. That power is 100% contracted to utilities in California. And often when we think about project development and inequality, we're thinking about the project itself. One of the things that we're excited about with the Cape Station project, our first large-scale project, is that this will directly contribute to taking aging gas plants offline in California. So if we're worried about the annual extension of once-through cooling, dirty, polluting gas plants in historically disadvantaged and underserved communities in California, the way we do that is building clean, firm power inside and outside the state and doing that faster. And so thinking about the way these systems are interconnected, I think is going to go a long way in focusing us on the fastest pathway to righting those wrongs.
Just really quickly, I think that's really true, and that is a really important factor of especially the Intermountain West and the power. It's mostly coming here. The other thing, just because obviously this is a business school conference, and part of this, we designed the community benefits plan first and foremost as a project risk mitigation approach. We have seen that where there is engagement with communities, and by engagement I don't just mean you have a couple of community meetings. I mean you're actually doing the work to do basic economic development work, asset mapping of the community. What do you actually have? What's your existing infrastructure? What's your existing, transportation network? What kind of skills are in the community? Through to actual engagement with workers in the community, through to like long-term structures, not just advisory councils, but sometimes even equity sharing approaches. What we've seen is that doing those things reduces project timelines on permitting and siting and reduces litigation risk down the line. There is a real reason to do this, and it is not just because it looks good on your ESG filing. It's because you actually can get projects done, whereas you might not have them done at all if you don't go through these kind of due diligence, and or they might be done badly. And frankly, the worst thing that can happen with this whole build out of the clean energy economy, in my perspective, honestly, is if we put a bunch of projects in places that can't support them for one reason or another, and they fail, and then you have a place that lost a coal plant, and then they lost the next thing, and that community is just as, in just as dire circumstance if the thing they lost was clean than if the thing they lost was coal, right? It's either way, it's their tax base and their economic stability. So I think that we have to be really, really focused on this because it's necessary for project viability and because it's necessary for political viability. We have seen over and over around the world that if projects are forced onto communities without engagement, without attention to how it's going to actually work in the place, that's where we get the protests. That's where we get the yellow vest protests. That's where we get the farmer protests that are happening right now. This is politically necessary.
Yeah, on the permitting piece, our project, it took 3 months to go from application through the NEPA process to receive an environmental assessment for our first 29 wells. It's about as fast as you can go through
That's
an
really
EA.
fast.
Frankly, it's shocking. Yeah. And as I will often say, that line, which is technically true from application to FONSI, finding of no significant impact, as my boss Tim will often say, well, it took us 2 years to apply for the EA. So it's not to say that that's too long of a process, but it is to say the 3 months was a fast 3 months because of the previous 24 months, because we received, I think, 3 or 4 comments in the whole process submitted to the BLM, all of which on our behalf from the town of Milford, the city of Beaver, and the county of Beaver. And it's that sort of support for what we were doing, which helped
Really helps.
support the federal government in moving things forward.
It's a great example.
Well, we could take this conversation in so many directions. I want to just follow up on one point that both of you were sort of touching on maybe in different ways, which is we're moving toward a much more electrified economy. And at the same time, we are struggling to build the electric infrastructure, the wires, the linear infrastructure that we need to construct in order to move energy from wherever it gets made, in Utah perhaps, to where it's needed in the South Coast. And FERC this week took a big step. DOE, or last week I guess, DOE also took a big step in terms of designating the first or the latest round of hopefully of many national interest electricity transmission corridors. What's your perspective on kind of where we are in terms of, and I should just back up and say, there's great work that's been done by Jesse Jenkins at Princeton. It just shows visually what the impacts of not building enough electric transmission will be on the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act.
80% of the benefits of IRA.
It's
if
bad.
We don't build out enough transmission.
What's the line? No transition without transmission?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's your perspective on where we are with that process and the challenges we have overcome and the ones that remain?
Yeah, I mean, I can be, it is a huge deal, right? Like transmission is the Eisenhower highway system of the moment, right? This is the only way that we actually do all the stuff we're trying to do with meeting our climate goals, becoming more resilient, meeting our economic goals, getting more, frankly, I do a lot of work in California and we have a really hard time attracting clean energy manufacturing to this climate leader state because we don't have reliable electricity. This is a really, really big issue. The states that are competing well on manufacturing and on these projects and through OSED are the ones with either, frankly, hydro or nuclear. They're the ones with very consistent clean power. That's not surprising, right? So we have got to do better on this. And I think we're doing, I'm really, really glad the infrastructure bill put the grid in as like a fundamental infrastructure. That is a step in the direction, including grid resilience. I love the work being done on reconductoring because I think that which is yay Berkeley, a lot of that at Berkeley. I think it's really important to think about not just building out an entire new thing, but actually repurposing what we have to the extent possible. And just, you'll hear me say that a lot. We can't just throw out our industrial infrastructure and start again. We have to repurpose. Reconductoring is interesting because you don't have to do new permitting in a lot of places to do new high voltage lines on the same corridors. So we should look at that. I'm encouraged, I'm very discouraged by the current state of interconnection queues. Anyone out there who's tried to do a renewable project and got yourself onto the grid has been faced with like literally decades long timeframes. Some of that, interestingly, little side note, is a workforce issue. A few decades ago in the United States, we sort of pedagogical and education policy decisions to, one, get rid of most of our career tech education and send everyone to 4-year academic degrees, and two, to send all our engineers to computer sciences. And doing those two things.
Not here.
We would never do that.
Doing
here.
those two things means that there's no power system engineers anymore. And power system engineers are the people who do the interconnection queues. So Bonneville Power has like 2 people who do their queue, as an example. And their queue is 3,000 lines long. So I'm just saying. So these are all issues, but I'm encouraged. I'm going to end on a hopeful note here. This is one of the places where AI is super interesting, right? Like the DOE is doing a bunch of work to try to figure out the use of AI in NEPA processes to go through hundreds of thousands of documents to find sort of like, similar applications to look for similar arguments. They're looking at it for interconnection queues to group projects by geography and type of project and to cluster them so that they can be evaluated more efficiently. Like, this kind of stuff is encouraging, but like Michael, I mean, this is the single biggest challenge. I'll just come back to, it's going, again, the clean energy industry, the clean energy future is an industrial future. We have to get over our current state of affairs in the US where we don't want industrial projects. We've got to get back to a place where we're accepting, again, that in order to have a more resilient economy that's more fair and cleaner, we have to build stuff.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for ending on a hopeful note.
I mean, you got to try, or else we'd all just go home and clown our
Marginally
heads.
less hopeful. The transmission piece is really challenging. Yes, software can go a long way. I think there are obviously process improvements to think about how we build, or get transmission and interconnect. Right now in the West, at least, we're doing transmission policy and transmission planning through the interconnection queue, which for folks who work in project development, that's like completely backward. And every example of building transmission first and then, like the Texas example and MISO example, like it works pretty well if we go that way. What makes me more pessimistic maybe, or less optimistic, and gives an important role for policy and I think engagement with these government institutions, is the challenge comes down, even if you make things faster, there's a collective action problem, there's a regulatory challenge around business models, there's the whole cost allocation mess, which is like who actually pays for this stuff, and there's then the cost issue, which is building a lot of transmission is still fundamentally extremely expensive. It's still a lot of poles and wires, it's expensive, and that's gonna factor into bills, and at the same time we're trying to do this whole infrastructure transition on the rest of the grid. How we manage that through financing mechanisms, through equitable rate structures, and investments in efficiency at the front end, like those pieces all matter a lot, and just moving things through the process faster doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be built on a faster timeline. So anyway, there's hope, I suppose.
Very hopeful.
So now I want to broaden a little bit. The three of us are very energy focused, even sometimes electricity focused people. This meeting is about sustainability. The work of the Accelerator is about sustainability in a much more broad frame. And I think I feel very optimistic. I'm teaching energy law for the first time in a few years, and I look back at my old slides about where we were, about capacity deployed and energy generated, and I look at what today looks like. And it actually makes me optimistic. Maybe we're not moving quite as fast as I would like personally, but we are moving in a way in the United States that we were not 10 years ago, even, and certainly 15 to 20 when I started teaching this stuff and we're all arguing about which scrubber to put on a coal plant. So what can we learn? What can we generalize to move out of energy and start to make progress on a broader set of sustainability issues having to do with water, with food, with broader industrial decarbonization? Are there things we can learn from the success we seem to be achieving, however limited, maybe it's not quite as fast as we would like. I think the three of us would like to go faster. That we could take to these other spaces?
I mean, to go way up, I mean, I do spend a lot of my life thinking about other actually resource-based economy things like food and wood and various things. And all of this is happening, this whole energy transition conversation is happening in the context of like a bunch of transformations of the global economy, right? Which I actually think are necessary to think about in any field that you're in at this point. We are in a looking between, like just even 5 years ago, and 5 years ago or 6 years ago, I was doing a lot of work with China, so I have China on my mind, but we are in a profoundly different geopolitical situation than we were 5 years ago. We had COVID underscoring the influence of China on our supply chains and on the lack of resilience of our economy in the United States, and then Russia invasion of Ukraine and cutting off Europe, profoundly, kind of underscoring the vulnerability of Europe to Russia. So China and Russia, own and operate a lot of our global infrastructure and supply chains, and that became a concern. I think we all knew that already, but it became a concern because of COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war. That transition happening at the same time as really a fundamental shift away from neoliberalism, a fundamental shift away from the global kind of economic theory that the world is flat and frictionless and everything just, the classic Jack Welch quote about how if he could just put all of his operations on a barge and move them to the low labor cost and low energy cost places, that's what he would do, right? That's sort of like the fundamental of neoliberalism or globalization, how we practiced it, and that's sort of falling apart because A, what happened with China and Russia, but B, climate impacts. Climate impacts are increasingly affecting those supply chains. The world is not flat and frictionless. So those things are leading, and then third, you have this big energy transition, which is going, as I said earlier, from this very globally traded commodity space to this like things connected by wire space. Everything's becoming more local, and I think that's happening in all of these industries. Everything's becoming more local, and that's kind of uncomfortable for people because all of us were raised on this idea that the most important thing is low cost and bringing the cheapest goods to consumers. And I think we're now getting into a space where we're having to rethink that a little bit. How are the things produced? How are we getting them? How vulnerable are they to climate shocks? What are there trade-offs to be made, quality or sustainability for cost? Is the lowest cost always the right answer from a global sustainability perspective? I just think it's all shifting, honestly, and in a really, really interesting ways that are super uncomfortable for people. And we're going to have to really address this cost question. I mean, on the electricity side, I've said this many times, and I'm sure Michael and I have talked about this, insurance costs and electricity costs are those are going to be the defining issues of California policy for the next 5 years. And those things are both about climate, actually, fundamentally. But I think that's going to be true across the board. We've got to really start thinking about business models that actually prioritize circular economy, reuse, recycling, using less, being less wasteful, doing things locally as a trade-off for doing things cheaply. This is just a different world. And, going back to the earlier panel, I think that's going to be particularly tricky in the venture space, but for folks who are used to getting big returns by bringing costs down very quickly and getting to the most consumers possible, I think we've got to really think about what does this look like from a finance perspective going forward. That was a long,
that's okay.
30,000-foot answer.
I think on that note, we have 5. Oh, great. Okay, I was wrong on my time.
Sorry, Ben.
Do you want to respond?
No, I thought that was well said. I was going to go in a different direction. Just think about with the looking back with the benefit of hindsight, and we think about, I think a little bit about risk, and this question, frankly, about the transmission piece. Not to make it about energy again. Sorry.
Energy
you guys know how my wife feels now. It's all I can do.
There is no economy without energy, so I think it's okay to talk about it.
But I think it's more broadly applicable to think jumping ahead, I think we overweight the short term. Maybe with a VC lens on, there's a shorter sort of eyesight, pathway on to think about when you return, when the exit is, how fast can this become, at reaching that scale that needs to achieve for the IRR or something like that. And rather, if we think a decade back, directionally, where was everything going? And if we just kind of we know where things are going, and if you have an idea of that, can we be a little bit riskier, frankly, in what I think is ultimately lower risk, but like it seems risky to build a transmission line where there isn't any projects interconnecting right now, right? But if we know that there's really good solar and wind resources there, and we know that there's going to be electricity growth, like maybe we kind of feel okay with that because we know where the broader energy system is going. I have a sense that while I know nothing about, say, the water system, there is applicability in these other areas to thinking about where that ball is going and being a little bit more bold in pushing forward to that ultimate destination.
Last question. We've had a very U.S. focused and even Western focused conversation so far. I agree that the neoliberal approach to many of these issues is breaking down, to say the least. But we also have friends and allies. And our friends and allies have also really different approaches to many of these issues, right? I think about the contrast between the U.S. approach on energy and climate and the EU approach on energy and climate. Do you think that, like, how do you think about, the scaling of technologies, especially in Europe, which is another major developed economy market, as you think about the different technologies that you're working on, and is that something you think about, and if so, how do things have to work differently to take account of that context?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing a lot of this in the UN context. There is a lot of ally, kind of, the whole idea of energy clubs and sort of allies working together on specific technologies. You actually saw this with the Biden administration relaxing some of what Congress put out on the EV policy, because we actually ran into challenges with some of our European partners, and we actually do need to work really closely with allies. So, where there are aligned interests in terms of, I think in particular, labor standards and environmental standards, there's a lot of room for hope, and, where we're thinking about resilience, like we're thinking about not being over-dependent on supply chains where there's a lot of risk. But ally relationships are not going away. I am not in any way arguing we close the borders. We can't. There are large pieces of lots of these supply chains that we just do not have the competitive advantage in at this point. And it does not make sense to try to build them because we don't want to build out stuff that's so dependent on policy and subsidy that it won't last. Again, going back to, we don't want communities to lose their industries once again, right? So ally is really important. Obviously the developing world also, there's so much building going on in so many parts of the world. And one of the great things about the neoliberal approach was that it reduced inequality across countries. We saw a lot of middle class, bringing up a middle class in a lot of developing economies, but it increased inequality within countries pretty much across the board, including the United States. So I think what we have to think about is, like, as we as a country are doing international finance, development finance, blended finance, we actually do need to be thinking about how do we get sustainable, resilient, equitable economies in every one of these places in the world. That shouldn't be something reserved for developed countries.
We have one of the great technical resources in the world here with the national labs, and I do think the US does early commercialization and that whole sort of technology investment from a government perspective does it a lot better than anywhere else in the world because of that vetting resource. There's other next generation geothermal energy technologies that receive more money from their government in the EU. I don't think that they're going to ultimately be more successful than we will be in the US because of that resource. But to Kate, your prior point about everything being more local, like project development gets as local as it gets. I don't speak French. I can't go build in France. So I do think like there's a big space here in the world of terawatts for lots of successful project development that we can pioneer here and export later.
Thank you both so much. I'm getting the hook, and it's been a pleasure having both of you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great to see you.